Jamie Rhome, Deputy Director of the National Hurricane Center. It's an honor to have you back on the podcast again today. The last episode I did with you was a hit. It was award-winning, in fact. So I love the way that you talk about just the human impact of hurricanes. And we're just getting into the season. So let's dig into what to expect this year, what we can learn, how we can stay alive, all of the good stuff. The last episode, I didn't get much background information on you, and I want people to get to know you as well. So, your role is Deputy Director. Can you tell everybody what that means?
Well, I mean, a good deputy should be largely invisible, meaning, they're sort of running the day-to-day operations, but seamlessly. You're putting out a lot of fires, not, figurative. I mean, figurative, not literal. There's budget execution, making sure the bills are paid, making sure the staff are attended to, making sure the facility is well maintained and functional and ready for hurricane season. I'm in charge of what we in government call continuity of operations, which is the backup plan for the National Hurricane Center should anything happen down here. And that's both the technology and the people, sort of ensuring the day-to-day operational readiness. So, on any given day, that could look different depending on whether you're in season or out of season, whether something is breaking and needs to be fixed, whether there's a financial situation where you need to allocate money quickly. Let's say there's a problem that needs to be fixed, and that can take on different forms depending on where you are in a fiscal environment, good fiscal year versus bad fiscal year, so on and so forth. So it's kind of fun in the sense that I never quite know what I'm going to walk in and see on any given day. So, you don't start off the day with, hey, at 10 a.m. I'm going to do this. You kind of walk in and you're presented with a set of issues. So it's different every day. It's totally different. So it makes it fun and exciting.
And you're not really invisible either, because we do see you. We see you, doing TV interviews. We see you at conferences. We see you on YouTube doing the live streams for the hurricane updates. So you are a busy guy.
Yeah. So the YouTube, the live stream things, the reason I got sort of in that was being a typical deputy. We needed to come up with new technology. The trends in media consumption were shifting in a different, away from the traditional media, television to more internet-based and different platforms. And we didn't have the setup here to allow us to migrate. So I had to start doing research and just sort of figuring it out. There's nobody in government you can call and say, hey, give me a blueprint for live streaming. And it was, there's all these IT protocols in government that people may or may not know, and these fancy FISMA bound, there's all this stuff that you got to deal with in government. So I basically had to find my own way through that. And the best way to do it was to test it, and I felt bad because sometimes I didn't know, and I didn't want to stick the director out there and have like a, some sort of failed, botched, thing. It was funny. I called some of our first examples of this the Blair Witch Project because the camera shook. The audio was not great. The lighting was bad, or there was good lighting, and then there was bad light. We went through the whole thing of trying to figure this out. So that's how I ended up kind of. I had to do it to fix it or to know how to fix it, and so I just sort of fell into that, just trying to be a good deputy and make things happen. And then it was funny, nobody else in the Weather Service was really doing this at the production scale that we were doing it. It was really funny watching the evolution, because in the beginning, the production was so poor, everybody was like, look at that, that's cute, they're trying. And then at some
point,
point,
those scientists trying to do TV.
Right. And then at some point we turned the corner. Like the lighting became good, the production became good, the graphics became good. And then some of the heavy hitters, who I won't name, were like, whoa, they sort of turned the corner, if you will. And now a lot of other people in the Weather Service and agency are coming to us asking how to do it. I never sat down and sort of wrote it down in like a book, like chapter 1, chapter 2. It's sort of all in my head. And so we're struggling now to sort of help these other entities have a similar setup.
You guys, didn't you use Craig Setzer for some of that too?
Yeah, so you said you wanted to get to know me. So by my accent, I'm Southern, and Southerners are really good at like community neighbor asking for help. So I knew quickly that we needed help. Just IT alone is if you there's no company to call and say I need studio quality lighting, right? Or they're going to charge you an astronomical amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
You really had to kind of figure it out, to do it. And Craig's really handy with his, fixing things like me. And so, we hired him, and he was able to help, build in some of I mean, I should have taken a picture. It would have been great. But Craig at one point was up on a ladder changing out the bulbs in our lighting because the color temperature was too hot. It was too orange.
Mm.
So you get a sense of the types of things he was helping us with. But if you ever want to tease him, to this day, he used to tell me I needed to smile more often on
We don't
television.
all have Craig Setzer teeth, though.
Right? And I was talking to him. I was like, "Well, it's a disaster. How do you smile when when
Right.
it's a disaster?"
Yeah.
But if you ever, or anybody listening ever want to tease him, he still to this day tells me I need to smile more.
Greg's a good guy. Chief meteorologist at Royal Caribbean now, for anybody who doesn't know. He was a podcast guest as well. Okay, so you said Southern. I know you're an NC State guy, undergrad and grad. Did you grow up in North Carolina?
Yeah, I was born in Virginia, in Southern Virginia, but I was only there for a few weeks of my life, and then 99.9% raised in North Carolina. I went to school at North Carolina State University. I grew up on winter weather. That's kind of what I thought I was going to do. Is Raleigh, Raleigh Durham, where I grew up, is kind of right where the rain, snow, ice line sets up. So that was kind of my thing, and I thought I was going to go in that direction. And as fate would have it, a couple of hurricanes in North Carolina while I was in school or in college, and in last couple of years of high school put me on a different vector. And I was very lucky when I applied for the Hurricane Center at the time, and it's still sort of the same advice that you have now, is it was so competitive to get in the weather service that the advice was start applying well before you graduate or you want a job. So I started applying 1 year into my master's program or 1 year before graduation. The thought was, you got to work through the process, the paperwork, all these requirements, very demanding. Usually you need a couple cracks at it. You need a couple chances to do interviews to get good at that. So I figured, well, if I'm applying just for the sake of, getting some reps in, why not apply to the National Hurricane Center? Well, 5 weeks later, they called and said, when can you be here? And I was like, what do you mean? It was like, it's peak of hurricane season coming up. We need you here as quickly as possible. And I had to stop everything, pack up, and move to Florida. And then I finished my master's degree from remote from afar. But I mean, that was never the plan. It was never the plan to end up in hurricanes or the Hurricane Center. But boy, has it been one heck of a ride, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
And how many years have you been there now?
That was 1999. So this will be my 26th hurricane season.
Okay, so you've seen some stuff in 26 years. I want to kind of talk about the evolution of forecasting in that time since you've been there and how it's improved, and then if that's translated to success. And then, we'll dig into measure of success and all that. But what have you seen really change in like the past 20, 25 years?
We used to do a lot of things by hand, like old maps. We used to plot the fixes. The fixes are what we call the center location. When recon goes in or satellite, you have the little map with all these little dots on it. In the best track, you would draw that. That was all paper and pencil, and these huge big maps and drawing boards. And then we used a lot of rule of thumbs back then. If the environment was conducive for intensification, the rule was you would basically increase it by what we call a T number, which is in reference to the Dvorak technique. One T number, corresponds to X amount of wind speed, and you would just systematically. That was it. You one T number a day. maybe 15 knots per day, right? And kind of move it right on along. The notion of rapid intensification, or the ability to explicitly forecast rapid intensification, was that was so far. And so while track has had this really steady improvement, I would say the intensification part is the most, not shocking, but feels the most dramatic from a science and technology perspective, because it really has been the last 5 or 6 years that it's kind of come on strong. And now we're making the forecasters now, I don't forecast anymore, but the forecasters now are making forecasts that us old timers are like, wow, that's impressive, that not only you can do it and get it right, but you have the confidence to just say it with, like, extreme. You've seen some of the recent storms. It's been the confidence factor, and the messaging has been very, very high. And some of that is just so rewarding to watch. The tools on the floor, the operations floor now, are so sophisticated, high resolution wind analyses, these mesoscale type models that they use now. It's really fun to sort of see it evolve.
What's the reason for that? Is it all the stuff that we have now that we can measure hurricanes in real time with, all of the stuff flying in or going under or above the storms?
It's all the above. I mean, you'll see people sort of latch onto one aspect. 4 or 5 years ago, it was the increases in computing power that everybody latched onto. More recently, it's in vogue to talk about observational systems and the rapidly expanding operational networks that we have. And then now, this season, a little bit last year too, everybody wanted to talk about AI. But it's all of the above. These technologies are kind of trendy in the sense that when people want to talk about them, doesn't always coincide with when the trends start or when the technology starts, if that makes sense. For example, everybody wants to talk about AI, but for us, it's kind of fun because we've been using AI for as long as I can remember. Back when I was forecasting, we were using early forms of it. Certainly, it's the depth of machine learning has improved. It's dramatically better. But AI is nothing nothing new to our forecasters at all. So it really is all of the above. Um, and then I think too, the part that gets left out is the communication aspect. Even if the science and technology is improving at a breakneck pace, if we are unable to communicate or communicate it clearly, that investment never manifests itself into a societal improvement, meaning people never see it. We've got better and better communication and dissemination systems that are allowing us to bring that investment all the way home, in terms of research to operations. So it's kind of all of the above.
So, okay, so going back to like the 20 years ago, how has the public's perception of hazards changed in that time period? Do you think there's a better understanding by the public now of the dangers?
It is, but it's not moving quite fast enough. And it's it's a conundrum for us because, generally speaking, there is a window that people are interested in hurricanes or interested enough to take action to protect themselves. And it's usually like, middle aged, so people our age, right? And so we've made a lot of progress, but some of those people are aging out, and they're being replaced by a new generation that isn't as interested in that aspect. Or, to their credit, they came of age during COVID. Is a different world. They have a different expectation of how information is presented to them and how they interact with media content. And so it's a new challenge. So I really thought we were making progress for a while there, but as this newer technology and this next generation sort of age into the demographics that would typically take action, it's getting to be difficult, and we might be taking somewhat of a step back. And to make that less abstract, let's give an example. I mean, and I'm guilty of this too. How many of us rely on either an internet search or a chat GPT whenever we have a question, right? And so we don't write anything down, right? We don't write recipes down. You don't write formulas down. You don't write anything down, right? And then you need that information during a disaster. And None of that stuff works. Internet's down, your phone runs out of charge. And so that's kind of what we're working against, is the society has become sort of very much reliant on accessibility of data and information via digital services. What happens when those digital services go down?
Mm-hmm. I have an 11-year-old child who is really into VR, and I'm looking behind you here, and I can spot it from a mile away. So, okay, you guys are staying with the times here. You're staying pretty cool with these VR goggles. What are you doing with them?
So we had an experiment. We were partnering with the University of Georgia and Clemson University to try to develop VR content that would help younger people not only learn about the weather, but learn about the weather in ways that would motivate them to do something. So we've been for a couple of years playing around with simulations and simulation length. Length of a video is very important. The how real to make it. So you want to make it real enough that people feel the personalization component. They feel like this could happen, but you don't want to make it so real that you traumatize you know people. And so this is a delicate balance to have. We just launched our first VR probably I think last Wednesday, during National Hurricane Preparedness Week. Anybody can download and put it on your headset, and it shows. It's it's about 2 minutes, but it shows what it would be like if you stayed in a home that was in an evacuation area and the storm surge flooding comes in the home. We field tested this several times at public events, and we tried not to go to the traditional circuit that you and I all go to, the same conferences, the same, So we went to events where there weren't any meteorologists, there weren't any emergency managers, there were just regular, ordinary, public. And the response was overwhelming, if not motivational. We got more young people than we've ever gotten before. Even if they were just interested in the graphics package that we were using, they still came and did it. And maybe you can help me with this one. We got more women to come in and participate in this. The men were shockingly scared of it or reluctant to do it.
Not feeling vulnerable.
Right. But we got a lot of people to come up and engage. A lot of I would say people who are teenagers or early 20s, which is the demographic that we historically struggle with mightily. And now we've put it out there to sort of let people see. It could be emergency managers wanting to do an outreach event. Like I was talking with an emergency manager in a county in Florida that has like upcoming event, and they're trying to get the headsets and download it to use it that way. So there's a number of applications it could be used for. And this speaks to what you and I talked about last year during the podcast, the personalization, the increasing, trying to personalize this information for people.
What kind of feedback did you hear from people that surprised them about storm surge? Was there anything where they were like, I didn't know that that's how that happened?
Yeah, I think there's something about the VR that makes the experience very visceral. People try to stand up. We make them sit down so they don't like get dizzy and fall. They try to stand up. Some people try to swim. Some people hold their breath. Some people try to rise up above. There's something deeply emotional about the experience, and they all comment something to that effect in their own words, in their own way. They basically say that. But the money quote that I heard one day is a gentleman says, "This makes me sort of look back and question the decisions I've made in past hurricanes."
Wow.
So it is changing the hearts and minds of people in ways that previous outreach, you give people a pamphlet or sticker or whatever, a booklet, and people are sort of like, thank you, they're appreciative, they acknowledge there's something to read about or whatever, but it doesn't change their mind, their perception. This, for whatever reason, is, at least in the field studies we've done, I think three of these things. So we've probably reached several hundred people from a sample size perspective. But now Now that the question is, how do you scale it? Okay. NHC staff at a booth, you're only going to see 100, 200, 300 people. So how do you scale it up? And that's why we've sort of released it out there to see if other people in the hurricane preparedness community can make a go of it and give us feedback. Now, theoretically, what you would like is a library of these VR simulations, for different aspects of natural disasters and things like that. Right now we only have one solely, on storm surge, but it's a start, and we'll see where it goes.
Okay, so VR to communicate storm surge. Any other fun ideas in the works that are going to help people better understand hazards?
With the VR stuff, we're at early stages, but one could theoretically envision, not this season, I'm talking about off in the future, how the forecast itself might be delivered via that medium, and how the forecast might be tailored to the individual's location. Right now, most of our products and most of our communication is sort of at the community level. What sort of conditions might the community experience? Like, I'm in Miami, so if a hurricane was coming, what sort of winds might we experience in Miami, right? And obviously the conditions are going to vary wildly over a city as large as Miami. Your northern portion, look at Andrew when it went through here. Northern portions of the county probably had tropical storm force winds, whereas southern portions of the county got utterly devastated. So how do and that really changes the hearts and minds of people too. People, I know people in Broward County, which is the next county to the north, that tell me they went through a Category 5 hurricane. And I was like, no, you didn't. you had gusts to tropical storm force. But you see how that messes with people's perception, right? And then the next time a Category 5 is threatening, they're like, oh, it wasn't that bad, right? But if we can get to this personalization and this better sort of ability to like drill down and give people sort of user specific information, I think that's the next frontier in weather communication. It remains to be seen if the VR is the medium to do that, but you kind of sense where we're trying to go in the long term.
Communities. And when I mentioned the measure of success before, my first thought is survival, people who survive, how many deaths there are with a hurricane, and maybe property damage as well. But I'm curious if you can tell me, with the research that NHC has done about the deaths, I want to know who's dying, and then I want to know when they're dying, what they're dying from.
Yeah, so if you start at a 10,000-foot perspective, we track two forms of mortality, direct and indirect. So direct is what happens when the storm comes ashore: wind, storm surge, rain, flooding. So that's drowning, tree falling on your home, that sort of thing. Those are direct fatalities. Indirect is what's happening after the storm has passed, from things like heat exhaustion, carbon monoxide poisoning, lack of access to healthcare, stress and strain on the body, these sorts of things. Direct fatalities, thankfully, are generally going down, owing to some of the many advances that we just spent the last 20 minutes or so talking about. Mortality is going up, and this is we're still trying to figure out why. There's no great data set. It's a heavy topic, so you don't go to conferences where everybody's anxious to talk about death, and so there's not a lot of data out there, so you really have to cobble together the data sources. But we think what's happening is a society that is increasingly reliant on power. Now, we've always been reliant on power, but it used to be when you lost power, it was an inconvenience or an annoyance, but it's increasingly becoming life-threatening for some communities and some people. So, and then, or the loss of power sort of is the first of a cascading impacts. So, for example, let's just make it less abstract. You lose power. Your yard is all messed up. You got trees down, right? You got no internet, you got no TV, you got nothing to do, so you go out and start cleaning up your yard where it's 95 degrees with a heat index of 110 after a hurricane, and you do all this yard work. You get really, really hot, and you try to go to sleep, and your home is 80 degrees at night because there's no air conditioning, right? Well, and then you do it again the next day. So heat exhaustion sometimes isn't so much about the heat during the day, it's the inability of the body to recover at night, right? And so let's say you do that for a couple of days, and the next day you're helping your neighbor, right? Clean up their yard or whatever. You're trying to be a good person. Then there's a second night where you can't cool down. And then all of a sudden you got a problem. So you can see how the lack of power, it isn't the lack of power itself that is the cause of mortality, but it kicks off this sort of cascading type of impact. Or let's say you have health conditions, or, you're medically fragile and you're not feeling well. I mean, you can't pinpoint it. You don't feel great, but you don't go to the ER because you heard that there was a 12-hour wait. You can't call up your general practitioner and say, hey, can I just drop by? Can you squeeze me in? They're not open. So you naturally don't seek medical assistance. Whereas in a normal day-to-day world, you probably would. You probably would call your doctor and say, I don't feel well. Can I come by, see what's going on? Or maybe you go to a critical care just to have somebody check you out. But in a disaster, you don't. Or the hospitals are knocked offline. Your nearest hospital is damaged or not fully functional. And these are the things that are kind of, or here's another one. Someone gets really desperate and they acquire a generator, or someone loans them a generator, and they have no idea how to work the thing. And they're suddenly running a generator, and unsafely at that. So you can see how these sort of back end components are racking up. And it's worse than anyone imagined. There was a recent study, because we tend to track mortality for a few weeks, a few months after the storm, right? Where there was a recent study, a published study, where the authors went back and sort of tracked mortality for years, like 7 years after the event. And the phrase they used was excess mortality. And they went back in all these big hurricanes over the last sort of 20 years to track excess mortality. And what they found is hurricanes are killing more people than we ever knew. It's just sort of a slow trickle on the back end of the storm over the course of months and years. So it really is sort of this silent killer on the back end of the storm.
Can you give me an example of what a death 7 years after a hurricane might look like?
It could be the stress and strain. So let's take a community that's like utterly devastated, like Western North Carolina. Let's look at Western North Carolina. The emotional and psychological strain of losing your home and your sense of purpose and your sense of belonging and who you are and your sense of community, coupled with the financial strain and anxiety of rebuilding and fighting it out with your insurance company, and that emotional worry can have devastating impacts on people, both psychologically and physically. And they could succumb to a whole myriad of issues. Suicide is a big problem after hurricanes. Heart attacks and other forms of stress induced mortality. Sometimes people are so focused on rebuilding and getting their lives back together that they don't seek out routine medical care, like routine maintenance, if you will, or they don't have access to it. I mean, you look at Western North Carolina, I mean, for a long time there, and there's still some communities rebuilding. We're just going and getting a checkup. You and I are relatively easy to schedule and get one done. But after disaster, people might not go for a checkup for 2-3 years. And you can imagine all sorts of things might have cropped up during that time.
It seems like this is not only not an exact science of pinpointing how someone died, but also like really hard to track. I'm guessing part of the uptick is the fact that it is being tracked now, whereas maybe 30 years ago, that wasn't even a thought in anyone's mind.
Yeah, so it used to be we only really track direct deaths, right? And then Ed Rappaport, who was my predecessor at Deputy Hurricane Center, he kind of came along and wanted to do a better job of tracking the mortality, and really is credited with a lot of what we know about trends in mortality. And then that sort of pointed out that this indirect mortality was a larger cause of deaths than anyone sort of assumed or realized, which then helped us to focus on better tracking mechanisms. So some of the uptick is a deliberate attempt to better understand and track it, is better information to track it. And some of it is to your original question, like, what do we do about it? What's the cause? Well, that's the problem is, to make good policy, to hopefully, bring these deaths down, one has to know to know the story, the journey, and we're still in the early stages of figuring that out, especially if you look at excess mortality. Now, if two days after an event succumbs to a heart attack, working in their yard, it's pretty easy to deduce the vector. But what about somebody who dies 2 months after a hurricane, or 12 months after a hurricane? Then it becomes a little bit harder to sort of really unpack the full story.
I interviewed a couple of anchors in Asheville not too long ago, and they said that they are still now, every once in a while, they get in a new Helene death into the newsroom. That's interesting, almost a year later. Going back to the groups of people, I would obviously assume that a wealthier person, somebody with better means, somebody who speaks English is much more likely to survive a hurricane. Do you have any data or any research on that? The groups of people and who's most vulnerable?
No, we're still just sort of digging into that. And I think that is the next sort of level, because then you can start to tailor your messaging, right? So right now our messaging is sort of very generic because it's meant to serve like all populations, which, sometimes that messaging comes out as so generic that it's not always actionable. What we're trying to do is increasingly get to the point where we understand who needs what and then deliver that to them via a specific channel. So, for example, we're dabbling in different forms of media content that can be delivered via different channels based off the demographic. So, for example, people who follow us on Facebook or want a bit more information. Their attention span is longer. They want to know why. They want to know the details, how you got to this conclusion. And so you see the live streams are longer form because that customer wants to know sort of the why. Whereas you see some of the reels, for example, which are served up on other platforms, Instagram, what have you, is a short. They might be 45 seconds or 60 seconds tops, because that's generally trying to serve a younger audience that is not, you really got to put the bottom line up front. They're not so much interested in the why, just tell me what you need to tell me and let's move on. And so you are starting down that path, but there's clearly a lot more room to grow in that arena.
Yeah. With all the research you guys do you ever get to go out post hurricane and talk to people in the community?
All the time. It's one of the, I don't want to say favorite parts of my job, because people are experiencing utter devastation, but it's the most enriching and educational portion of the job. And we do this. Everybody thinks government is secretive, you're sneaking around, but we kind of do it out of respect for the people impacted. So when we go in, we don't want the TV cameras, we don't want people following us, we don't want these individuals' privacy disrupted. We want to be respectful of the individuals and what they've experienced. So when we do this, it's very quiet, and that has resulted in people not realizing that we do this.
I had no idea. You would think I would know that. I had no idea that you were doing that.
And it's on purpose to be mindful and respectful of the people who have experienced this. And so we do it for twofold. One, to chronicle the storm. In situ observations have never and will never fully encapsulate or sort of document a disaster. They just don't. They don't. The instrument fails. There's not enough of them. The peaks fall in between the instrument. So just looking at observations and making a hot take 24 hours after the storm, you're going to whiff every time. And there's no shortage of people standing in line to do that, I must say. To really understand a disaster, you have to be boots on the ground, damage assessment, damage surveys, and understanding what it did to the community, right? Look at what happened in Beryl in Houston, tropical storm, force winds, hurricane gusts. You would have never assumed that sort of impact to the community just looking at the wind speed. And so, yeah, we do it and we talk to people, and it's, usually it starts with, do you have any watermarks in your home? Can you help me find it? Can you help me tell me what you saw, what you experienced? Did you stay? Why did you stay? Did you leave? Why did you leave? What specifically did you hear that made you leave? This is some of the most enriching parts of the job in terms of determining what we do next. It's also incredibly therapeutic to the individual. Like, they're under massive duress and strain. And for us to show up and say, we're here to properly document what you experienced and to ensure we learn from it and that the nation is better off the next time, for whatever reason, provides them comfort. We never have any problems with people not wanting us around or sending us away. It's a deeply emotional experience too, which sort of speaks to, while I try to do it sort of generally quietly, you see people's possessions scattered everywhere, family photos, toys, things like that, just really scattered everywhere. But we learned so much. So the most recent one we did was Milton on the Florida West Coast. Afterwards, that one was necessary because, if you remember, all the sand that got sort of moved around, well, then that created a very, very, very unusual and difficult environment for determining how much water, because there were feet of sand. I mean, like 5, 6, 8 feet of sand deposited everywhere. It was probably the most difficult high water marking storm I've ever done in my 26 years, because there's just so much sand everywhere.
Geez, that has to be quite the weight to bear, though, in understanding exactly the role that the forecasters are playing, the communicators are playing when you see it on the ground like that post storm.
And I mean, and you learn so many things. And people are so crystal clear when they communicate after a disaster like that. I mean, they're able to communicate precisely what they heard and what they thought when they heard that, and how that motivated action, right? And it's never abstract. These people are like, well, the storm surge forecast was 4 to 7, and then it abruptly went up to 5 to 10, and that sounded like a lot of water, so I decided to go at that moment. I mean, so there's always like some little tipping point or piece of information that push people to move or to take action.
Any of those surprise you? Any of those moves were just completely out of the blue that you didn't know about before?
Well, generally speaking, there's a tipping point. So people are optimistic both that the storm's going to miss them or their ability to weather it. Typical person is, I've done this, I've been through this, I'm fine. My house is this many feet above whatever. And then it's so there's an optimism bias that it's not going to be bad, it's not going to be bad. And then there's a trend, there's a shift. So the track shifts, or the intensity goes up, or the intensity forecast goes up, or the hazard goes up, surge goes up. And at some point that just pushes them over, and they say that's enough. So it's a change in the forecast that is generally perceived as abrupt or sudden or large, that generally pushes people over the top. It's not a time. It's never a, yeah, well, the storm was headed at me all along, but we got within 24 hours, and I just it's always something is in their mind, real or perceived change, that does the trick. The most effective thing. We can't do this for all communities. There was a storm where I was especially concerned about Cedar Key, and we called the fire chief up and basically said, we're really concerned. Well, he came away with, I'm a tiny community. The Hurricane Center just called. They've never called before. They've never called before. It must be really bad. So, he started going door to door, knocking on the door and saying, hey, the Hurricane Center just called me directly. And that moved a lot of people out of Cedar Key. So, sort of deploying the local trusted individual in the community is really effective, but how to scale it for big cities is hard.
It has to be so rewarding, though, to know that you have that kind of power, that you can see something coming, that you can call a community, that you know that this guy went door to door and got people out of their homes, and that you were able to save lives because of that. That's a lot, Jamie.
Everybody, I'm glad because, I love to brag on the staff here so much, especially now where everybody thinks they can forecast hurricanes. And to some degree, that is the easier part of the job. The emotional weight that one carries around, both knowing what's ahead of you in terms of, there's going to be a storm and you're going to have to do your job. But then 26 years of weight, you carry that around. Like, was that the right decision? Did we overdo it? And then that community is not going to react like next time. So, you've got the whole Irma people still on the west coast of Florida, I think, because Irma didn't materialize the way they thought it would, that they're not going to do anything, right? So you carry all of that around, all of that, and you struggle with constant. Are you more restrained, right? Or are you more aggressive? You're trying to play with this sort of tug of war. And then you're crucified by the media afterwards. So you're already sort of in your own headspace wondering, was it the right balance? Should I have a message earlier? You're already kind of in that sort of natural tug of war with yourself. And then, for 3 or 4 days after the storm, the media just absolutely bludgeons you. That's just what sells these days, is sort of this creating a sense of failure, even when one doesn't, when success is there.
Yeah, meteorologists should have their own category of therapists. Okay, before I let you go, I want to get into the 2025 season. What's new for this year? When people are looking at products coming out from NHC, should they expect to look a little different or hear a little different? What should they expect?
Well, we're continuing this very steady march towards de-emphasizing the older pieces of communication technology, the Cone and Saffir-Simpson scale. So you're seeing it each year. There's a new piece of the chapter, a new piece of the puzzle, that we're not just going to like decommission the Cone and go cold turkey something new, to bring these newer things alongside of the Cone. So this year we're emphasizing rip currents, big push in the rip currents, a new risk current risk map to help people understand. And I bet you didn't know this. This is going to be the shock of the podcast. Storm surge mortality has dropped so abruptly in the last 10 years that more people die from rip currents now than storm surge.
And we're not talking like necessarily a storm that's on their doorstep either, right?
Correct. And that's why it's so tricky. So, if I were here telling you, hey, we're going to focus on storm surge, people would nod their heads, say, that makes sense, whatever. But when I say we're focusing on rip currents, everybody's like, that's an odd one. But when you look at it through the lens of mortality, it kills more people. And so, it's rip currents are the third leading cause of death in hurricanes over the last 10 years or so.
Is it rip currents or is it like surf related deaths? Because
we break out the surf. I mean, that's also a cause of death, but we try to break them out so that we used to conflate them, which is why it was hard to figure out what was happening. But now we're breaking them out better, and tracking rip currents more closely. The other thing is we're going to continue on year 2 of the Cone with inland watches and warnings. It was wildly popular last year. There was always this conventional wisdom that you couldn't touch the Cone. It was so institutionalized that if you did anything to it, there would be this uproar. We did polling, and the sample size is extensive because people have no shortage of opinions. I mean, they tell us, more than 9 out of 10 people like the new Cone, the experimental Cone with the inland watches and warnings. So to get 9 out of 10 people to agree to anything these days is stunning, but they like the new Cone. So we're going to continue with the second year. We had some comments to sort of increase the legibility of the understanding of the legend. So we made some minor tweaks to the legend to sort of be more explicit to what overlapping watch and warning means. And but that's largely it. We're still trying to figure out if we're going to sort of remember the experiment was sort of buried. You had to click on the old cone and then click on the link to keep going down. So I think we're going to try to pull the new cone forward on the website to make it a bit more prominent. There are other changes that are, maybe not as headliney, such as we can do potential tropical cyclone advisories now up to 3 days prior to arrival to give people more notice. So they don't sound like dramatic, but if you look at the last 5 or 6 years, you see the slow and steady march towards more emphasis on the hazards.
Yep. Baby steps towards that hazard communication. Cool. Anything new as far as that we can expect as far as messaging, communication coming from you guys?
Yeah. So, fun fact, as soon as I stop here with you today, we have a session with NHC staff on preparing them for hurricane season. And the things that we will be focusing on are power loss, how to deal with power loss, and flooding. Do you need flood insurance? How do you figure out if you need flood insurance? These types of things, we don't tend to talk about the meteorological. We want to talk about the weather, right? We want to talk about these things that we trained on. But when it comes to the actual information that protects people, like you said at the beginning of the show, how are people dying and what can we do to stop it? The Europeans over here and the GFS is over there. That's not, I know people are going to get upset. That's not saving anybody. Teaching them how to deal with power loss is saving them. Teaching them how to deal with the oppressive heat that comes after a storm is saving them. Now, you will hear on-camera meteorologists talk about that after the storm makes landfall. But there's a problem with that. If everybody's lost power and communication, nobody hears you, right? You only hear a discussion of power loss in like the final run up of a storm, and then after. We need people talking about power loss as part of hurricane readiness, number one, and then 48 72 hours before landfall, because that's when people have to get fuel if they're going to try to run a generator. They have to make sure the generator is functioning properly. There all these steps that people need to take, and we're just not talking about it.
Jamie, is there anything else you want to add? This is, how much longer are you going to be? This has to be emotionally exhausting for you. How much longer are you going to do this for?
I still love it. I'm old enough where, sometimes getting out of bed in the morning is tough, especially
Everything cracks.
if I've had an active weekend. But there's still something about it that just drives you. It's deep in your core that still drives you to keep trying. But I'm also old enough that the criticism and the negativity and the when you're young, that sort of stuff bothers you. And you lose a lot of emotional energy to it. But when you're older, you're sort of like, okay.
Eye on the prize.
Right. And there's just a sense of, I can't imagine the world without a hurricane center, or the country without a hurricane center, and a strong hurricane center at that. So the idea of getting up and trying to make it robust and strong each day still is appealing.
When I last talked to you was last November. You were putting a new roof on your house. Is there anything else that you are doing personally to prepare for this hurricane season?
Yeah, so the roof is installed. So I did metal roof, which, if you're not familiar, metal is more wind resistant than other materials. I'm also having both doors, front and back, replaced. There was nothing wrong with the old doors, had full wind mitigation, but they were getting old, right? They were getting older, and just, I felt better having them, replaced, not to mention they look better. So there's a lot of emphasis on hardening the home. I have already successfully tested both generators. I have two, and now I'm focused on helping the staff get ready, their personal journeys, and helping them makes me realize that some aspects of my kit need to be replaced, or I thought I had it and I didn't have it. So they're sort of indirectly helping me spruce up, my kit just by sort of walking a mile in their shoes.
Awesome. Jamie, Rhome, thank you so much for your time today. This is super helpful. Let's hope for a quiet, successful hurricane season this year.
Yeah, thanks again for yet another great opportunity to talk about not only something I'm very passionate about, but it's something that's really, really relevant and important this time of year.